In this video, we're going to look at epidemics such as Spanish flu and AIDS. Let's start with Spanish flu in the modern period. Spanish flu epidemic was absolutely devastating. Between 1918 and 1919, which was when it broke out, just in that 1 year, Spanish influenza flu killed almost 3 times as many people worldwide as the First World War had done in the years 1914 to 1918. So in 1 year it killed 3 times as many as it did over 4 years during the war. The symptoms were terrifying. Okay, it was the normal flu symptoms to start with, so a cold, high temperature, aches and pains. But this then developed into pneumonia. Your skin went blue and there was bleeding from the nose, ears and stomach. So equally terrifying. So where did Spanish flu come from? It's known as bird flu, okay? We later find out that it came from China, okay? You might get a question in your exam of what was the response to Spanish flu? How did people try and react to it? Well, they wore face masks to prevent contamination, just like we did with COVID, okay? They printed lots of information in newspapers, films and posters and gave advice on how to kind of treat this, which was through isolation, avoiding physical contact, etc. The difficulty is we don't have a cure for Spanish flu today. We do have some vaccines, such as the flu vaccine, okay, which might help to prevent against such things as Spanish flu, but we always could be hit with a new flu virus at any time, just like we were hit with COVID. Okay, our scientific advances only go so far, so to some extent we are still slightly defenceless. Okay, so it's not an awful lot to know about Spanish flu. You need to know when it started, okay, the symptoms, you need to know the responses, okay, it's quite basic, and the fact that we still don't really have a cure. That's why it's still an issue today. The main epidemic to look at is AIDS. Okay, so in 1970s, doctors in Europe, North America and Africa encountered a new strange medical condition. Victims suffered from pneumonia, severe weight loss and sores on their skin, which you can see here. These bodies wasted and then they died. No one at the time could explain, well, why is this happening? Okay, and then, 11 years later, 5 gay men and 1 man in Britain died of the condition. It appeared that this illness was a problem with the body's immune system, and it was given the name of AIDS. Acquired immune deficiency symptom is what it stands for. So, AIDS is not a disease. Unlike all of the other conditions that we've looked at in people's health, AIDS is not a disease, it's a condition where the victim's natural defences can no longer fight off infection. So you struggle to fight any infection if you get it. In 1986, doctors discovered the virus that caused AIDS and named it HIV. So you get a virus called HIV and then that leads to you having AIDS. Unlike other epidemics, as I said, it cannot be spread, okay? This disease cannot be spread through the air or touch, okay? Instead, it's spread by the blood and bodily fluid. So if you have sexual contact with an infected person, if you share needles, okay, because that's the passing of blood, if you receive a blood transfusion, which is blood going into your body from an infected person, or you are a child in the womb of an infected mother, that's how you can get AIDS, not through air or touch, like many of the other diseases that we've looked at. So, society and the government's response. How did the government deal with the AIDS epidemic? So, it can be divided into different phases. So we're going to look at the 5 phases and you need to make notes on those. Phase 1, okay, growing awareness, so becoming aware of what even AIDS was. So by 1982, 7 British people had died from AIDS. A friend of one of these victims set up the Terence Higgins Trust to fund research into the illness, but it was not talked about in the media, so it was like this hidden illness. In 1983, the media began taking more of an interest, so the year later, when a number of people developed AIDS from a blood transfusion. The government urged gay people and drug users not to give blood anymore. One newspaper article even used the headline, "Gay Plague." Okay, you can see here, my son's doomed by gay plague agony. Many people argued that AIDS should not become an epidemic like Spanish influenza, as it could and should be avoided if men didn't have sex together and if drug users kicked their habit. It's quite an interesting start to the awareness around AIDS and the misconceptions. Some church leaders, even in church, preached that AIDS was God's way of punishing gay men and drug users. So even in this society, we're going back to kind of the older beliefs that it was a punishment from God. So phase one was we were starting to become aware of this new illness. Now we've got phase two, growing alarm, so becoming alarmed by it. Between 1984 and 85, so a year later, the general public was still unsure as to how AIDS was actually spread. As a result, some fire service staff refused to give any mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, because they still believed it was passed through touch. On top of this, churches reported that some members of their congregation were refusing to drink the shared cup at Holy Communion. And there's one example of a school where students were withdrawn from a class once because one student acquired HIV through a blood transfusion. So we've got the reactions of people and the growing alarm here. In all of these cases, there was no risk of these people getting an infection, but it was just they were unsure of what was going on. So big public bodies made mistakes with a lot of what they were broadcasting. For example, the government ordered hospitals to detain people with AIDS, even if they wanted to leave. Doctors and nurses were told to wear gowns, masks and gloves, which reinforced the thought that it could be spread through normal contact, even though it couldn't. So, phase three, we're starting to grow a little bit more understanding. So we start off with the what is it, shocked about it, then we've got the alarm, and now we've got the growing understanding. We're starting to understand it a little bit more. During this period, lots of things were happening to try and improve the situation. Charity groups, even some church groups, provided clean needles to drug addicts to reduce cross-contamination. That's one thing they did. Free HIV testing was funded by the government, alongside screening for all blood donation. So we've now got the testing of HIV. An AIDS prevention campaign called Don't Die of Ignorance, and leaflets were sent out to every household. So we're now sharing information on it. TV programmes and posters to raise awareness, and this is quite a pivotal one here. You'll see this picture at the bottom. In April 1987, saw Princess Diana visit a clinic, and she shook hands with an AIDS victim, ensuring it was broadcast across the world. She advocated that people who suffered from it deserved compassion and respect, and it showed that it wasn't passed through plain touch. Okay, we're starting to accept it now, so we've got understanding, it's now being more accepted. One of the turning points in the acceptance of AIDS was in 1991 when EastEnders ran a storyline about a character who was HIV positive. Okay, so we've got a storyline in EastEnders that's making people more aware and more accepting. And then by 1995, around 25,000 people in Britain had been diagnosed as HIV positive. At the same time, Freddie Mercury, the lead singer of Queen, died from AIDS. A tribute concert was run and raised 20 million for AIDS causes. Of 12,000 of those that had developed AIDS, and around 8,500 died. So AIDS was very much still prevalent, but people were beginning to think about what they could do to solve it rather than be afraid of it. So Freddie Mercury did a lot in terms of the growing acceptance that this was something that society needed to support people with. So then it leads to a bit of complacency. We've got this awareness. In 1996, scientists devised a drug called antiretrovirals, which delayed the onset of AIDS. So it didn't stop it, it didn't get rid of it, it just delayed the onset of AIDS. Although they were expensive, the government did fund the antiretrovirals. Although this was excellent news, it had unexpected consequences. The government became more relaxed about HIV and AIDS and campaigns because people began to think that antiretrovirals were an AIDS cure and they weren't. So the government stopped providing information about AIDS. People became complacent and thought, well, we've got a cause, we've got a cure, so we don't need to think about it. However, this led to cases of HIV infection rising. So more people were starting to get HIV because of the lack of understanding around it and information that was out there. And actually in 2009, which wasn't that long ago, there were 100,000 people in Britain with HIV. About 40,000 were gay men and the rest were heterosexual men and women, and about 25% were unaware of their condition and may have unknowingly be spreading it. This discovery of this treatment seems to have worsened things. So although they came up with the treatment, it didn't actually help because it led to a lack of understanding and a lack of information out there. So an exam question that you might get on AIDS is something like this. Write a clear and organised summary that analyses responses to AIDS epidemic in Britain since 1900. And in that question you would talk about the different phases, about people's beliefs about AIDS and about how the government created things like the antivirals, antiretrovirals, and the effect that that had. Okay, let's finish off with a few questions. Have you been listening?